Every sunrise began with the same silent warning, and the only one who seemed to understand that something was terribly wrong was a gorilla that refused to stop pointing at a patch of ordinary ground no larger than a picnic blanket. Visitors at Pine Ridge Wildlife Preserve laughed the first time they noticed Koba stretch out his massive arm toward the exact same place just beyond the edge of his habitat. But the laughter slowly disappeared as the days turned into weeks, and nothing about his strange ritual ever changed. Koba was known throughout the preserve for his calm personality. He greeted familiar keepers with gentle curiosity, spent long afternoons watching birds drift across the trees, and rarely showed interest in anything outside his daily routine. That was why Ranger Mason Brooks couldn't ignore what everyone else dismissed as an odd habit. Every morning, almost to the minute, Koba walked away from his breakfast before taking a single bite, crossed the enclosure without hesitation, stood facing the eastern fence, and pointed toward one lonely patch of earth. He never pounded his chest. He never made loud calls. He simply pointed, stared, and waited as if expecting someone to finally understand. At first, Mason assumed Koba had buried fruit there weeks earlier, but inspections found nothing. The maintenance crew searched the surface. Groundskeepers trimmed the grass. Heavy rain washed the soil clean more than once. Nothing changed. The next morning, Koba returned, raised the same arm, and pointed again. Soon, every employee had an opinion. One believed the gorilla had become fascinated by shadows cast by the rising sun. Another suggested underground insects were attracting his attention. A visiting biologist proposed it might be repetitive behavior caused by boredom. None of the explanations satisfied Mason because Koba ignored every other distraction. Fresh treats couldn't pull him away. New climbing structures couldn't hold his attention. Even when another gorilla invited him to play, Koba would quietly leave, walk back to that exact location, and lift his finger toward the ground with unwavering certainty. The routine became so precise that Mason began checking his watch instead of the preserve's schedule. At 7:12 every morning, Koba would already be waiting. Cameras were installed overlooking the area, but they revealed nothing except the same unsettling pattern. Koba arrived first. He pointed. He waited. Then he slowly looked directly at the nearest ranger before walking away without another sound. It was almost as if he believed they were refusing to listen. One cool morning, with fog still hanging over the trails and only a handful of staff members beginning their shifts, Mason noticed something he had never seen before. Instead of immediately pointing, Koba carefully picked up a broad green leaf, carried it across the enclosure with unusual care, laid it gently over the same patch of ground, stepped back, and only then extended his finger toward it. Mason felt a chill run through him because that wasn't random behavior anymore. It looked deliberate. It looked like a marker. And before anyone could decide what it meant, Koba slowly turned his eyes toward Mason, held his gaze without blinking, and refused to lower his arm. Mason did not answer the silent request that morning because he simply did not know how. As the other staff returned to their routines, he remained standing near the observation fence while Koba slowly lowered his arm, picked up the broad leaf once more, and carried it back to a shaded corner of the enclosure as though the task had failed again. That single moment stayed with Mason for the rest of the day because it was the first time he had ever seen disappointment on the gorilla's face. Koba was not acting frightened or aggressive. He looked tired. There was a heaviness in the way he walked that did not belong to an animal waiting for food or attention. Over the following week, Mason quietly changed his own schedule without telling anyone. He arrived before sunrise, carrying a thermos of coffee and a notebook instead of relying on the preserve's official reports. Every morning unfolded almost exactly the same. Koba would wake before the rest of the troop, sit alone in complete silence for several minutes, then slowly make his way toward the eastern fence without glancing at any of the enrichment toys scattered around the habitat. The younger gorillas often invited him to climb or wrestle, but he gently stepped away from them without irritation, almost as if he could not allow himself to be distracted. Visitors continued taking photographs because Koba was one of the preserve's most recognizable residents. Yet Mason noticed something most people missed. Koba never looked toward the crowds anymore. Months earlier, he had often watched children laugh outside the glass, tilting his head with quiet curiosity. Now his eyes always drifted back toward the same lonely stretch of earth beyond the fence. It was as though every other part of the world had slowly faded into the background. The veterinary team performed a full health examination and found nothing unusual. His weight was healthy. His eyesight remained excellent. His hearing showed no decline. Blood work revealed no illness. Every measurable sign suggested Koba was perfectly healthy, but Mason could not ignore the feeling that something deeper was weighing on him. One afternoon, he searched through years of behavioral records hoping to find another animal that had displayed anything remotely similar. The files described favorite foods, social interactions, seasonal habits, and medical histories. Yet nowhere did he find a case of a gorilla returning to one precise location every single morning for weeks without missing a day. Even longtime keepers who had worked with great apes for decades admitted they had never witnessed such unwavering determination. As the days passed, another subtle change appeared. Koba began carrying small objects with him during his morning walk. One day it was a smooth stone. The next it was a short twig. Then a handful of dry leaves. He never left those items anywhere else. He always placed them gently near the same patch of ground before sitting several feet away in complete silence, as though he was quietly keeping watch over something only he believed still mattered. Mason stopped seeing the routine as strange behavior. It felt more like a promise that Koba refused to break. Then, on a cool Friday morning, just as the first rays of sunlight reached the fence line, Mason noticed the objects Koba had carefully arranged over the previous days had all disappeared overnight. And for the first time since this mysterious ritual had begun, Koba looked genuinely confused. Koba's confusion did not fade the next morning. Instead, it transformed into something that unsettled everyone who watched him. Rather than replacing the missing objects one by one, he began searching every corner of his habitat with unusual purpose, carefully selecting items that no gorilla had ever shown interest in before. He ignored fruit peels and colorful enrichment toys, choosing only flat pieces of bark, smooth river stones, and long blades of grass that he carried with remarkable care between his fingers. Mason noticed that Koba never dropped them randomly. Each object was positioned with incredible precision around the same patch of ground beyond the fence, almost like invisible points on a map that only he could understand. By the end of each morning, the arrangement looked deliberate, yet no pattern made sense to the human eye. When groundskeepers entered nearby pathways to clean leaves or trim bushes, Koba immediately abandoned whatever he was doing and hurried to the observation fence. He did not display aggression or panic. Instead, he gently tapped the glass barrier 3 slow times with the back of his hand before extending one finger toward the distant spot again. The behavior repeated every single time someone approached that area. Staff members began exchanging uneasy looks because the timing was impossible to ignore. Visitors started asking whether the famous gorilla had developed an obsessive habit, and rumors quietly spread across the preserve that something was wrong with him. Some believed age had changed his behavior. Others wondered whether hidden stress was affecting him despite his clean bill of health. Mason resisted those conclusions, but even he could not explain why Koba's routine was becoming increasingly elaborate. Hoping to understand more, he reviewed hours of security footage recorded overnight. Nothing unusual appeared until just before dawn. At precisely the same time every morning, Koba would wake without any audible sound, walk to the highest platform in the enclosure, and remain perfectly still while facing the eastern fence for several minutes before beginning his strange ritual. It almost resembled someone waiting for a signal that never came. The preserve director suggested reducing public viewing hours in case the constant attention was encouraging unusual behavior, but the change made no difference at all. Koba continued exactly as before, unaffected by crowds or silence alike. Then another detail emerged that no one could explain. Birds frequently landed near the mysterious patch outside the enclosure, yet before they stayed more than a few seconds, they always flew away together as though disturbed by something invisible beneath them. Mason mentioned the coincidence during a staff meeting, but no one considered it important. They reminded him that birds reacted to countless natural conditions. Even so, he wrote the observation into his notebook because his instincts refused to let it go. 2 mornings later, the atmosphere shifted again. Koba completed his careful arrangement of bark and stones, stepped back several feet, and instead of pointing with one hand as he always had, he slowly lowered himself onto both knees. Every employee nearby fell silent. With extraordinary patience, he pressed both open palms flat against the ground inside his enclosure, closed his eyes for several long seconds, and then lifted his head toward Mason before tracing a large circle in the air with one finger directly above the same distant patch of earth. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen him do before, and for the first time, several members of the staff quietly wondered whether Koba was no longer trying to show them a place, but trying to warn them to stay away from it. After the meeting ended, most of the staff accepted the decision without further questions, convinced that Koba's unusual routine had become an unhealthy fixation that needed to be interrupted before it grew worse. Mason wanted to agree, but something refused to settle in his mind. Every report described the gorilla's actions as repetitive, yet none of them explained why the pattern had remained so precise. Despite every change around him, that evening, long after visitors had left and the preserve had grown quiet, Mason walked alone along the maintenance path bordering the eastern fence. He was not looking for dramatic evidence. He simply wanted to understand why Koba never abandoned that single location. As he reached the area, a gentle breeze carried dry leaves across the ground. Most of them rolled freely over the uneven dirt, but a few stopped in exactly the same narrow strip where Koba always pointed. Mason crouched down, expecting to find a small rock or hidden branch blocking them. Instead, he noticed that the leaves settled into a faint circular outline before the wind pushed them away again. Curious, he picked up a thin metal measuring rod from a nearby maintenance cart and pressed it lightly into the soil. The rod slid easily through the first few inches, then met an unexpectedly firm surface that felt smoother than ordinary stone. He tried another spot only a foot away. This time the rod sank much deeper without resistance. He repeated the simple test several more times and discovered the same odd result. Only within that rough circle did the ground seem unusually solid beneath the surface. Mason marked the positions in his notebook but told no one. The following morning he arrived before sunrise, determined to watch Koba without interfering. As always, the gorilla approached the fence carrying several carefully selected pieces of bark. Mason expected him to arrange them in the familiar pattern, but Koba paused halfway, looked toward the exact place where Mason had quietly tested the soil the night before, and gently moved every piece several inches until they formed a nearly perfect ring surrounding that invisible boundary. It was the smallest adjustment Koba had ever made, yet it aligned almost exactly with Mason's handwritten measurements. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. Koba was not decorating the ground. He appeared to be marking the edges of something hidden beneath it. Mason folded his notebook shut and looked back toward the preserve buildings where the director's office lights had just turned on. If he reported only a feeling, nobody would listen. If he requested excavation without evidence, the proposal would almost certainly be denied. He needed facts, not instincts. Before leaving the area, he quietly borrowed a detailed property survey from the maintenance archive, determined to compare old site maps with the mysterious location before anyone carried out the plan to permanently redirect Koba away from the place he had refused to forget. The following morning, Mason arrived carrying more than an old property survey. Tucked beneath his arm was a faded engineering map of the preserve drawn decades before the current habitat had even existed. While comparing the measurements he had recorded with the original plans, one detail immediately caught his attention. The mysterious circle Koba had marked did not fall in the middle of empty ground at all. According to the forgotten blueprint, that exact location had once been the entrance to a small underground service chamber used during the preserve's earliest expansion. The chamber had been sealed long before Mason joined the staff, and over the years fresh soil, grass, and landscaping had erased every visible trace that it had ever existed. Intrigued, Mason requested permission to conduct a limited inspection before the maintenance crew permanently altered the area. Although the director remained skeptical, she reluctantly approved a brief investigation, convinced it would finally put an end to the strange situation surrounding Koba. As workers carefully removed only the upper layer of soil, nothing unusual appeared at first. Several employees quietly exchanged disappointed glances, believing the gorilla's mysterious behavior had been nothing more than coincidence after all. Mason was beginning to question himself as well when the tip of one shovel gently tapped against something flat beneath the dirt. It was not solid rock. It sounded hollow. Everyone immediately stopped. The workers switched to soft brushes and hand tools until the outline of an old steel hatch slowly emerged from beneath decades of packed earth. Rust covered nearly every inch of its surface, making it almost impossible to recognize. The preserve's oldest maintenance supervisor stared silently before whispering that he had heard stories about the forgotten utility chamber, but had always assumed it had been removed years ago. As the hatch was carefully lifted open, cool air drifted upward from below. A narrow concrete room appeared beneath them, untouched for decades except for dust, scattered leaves carried through tiny cracks, and a weatherproof metal storage case resting neatly against the far wall. Inside the case, they discovered maintenance journals, historical survey records, and emergency utility diagrams documenting drainage channels and underground infrastructure that no longer appeared in the preserve's modern files. The documents explained several recurring drainage problems that had puzzled engineers for years and identified aging water lines scheduled to pass directly beneath the area where future construction had recently been proposed. Mason suddenly realized what would have happened if heavy excavation had begun without rediscovering the forgotten chamber. The original records, along with critical information about the preserve's hidden infrastructure, would likely have been destroyed forever. At that exact moment, Koba quietly approached the fence overlooking the site. He did not point anymore. He simply watched in complete silence as Mason slowly looked from the open chamber back to the gorilla. Then Mason noticed one final detail that made his breath catch. The ring of bark, stones, and leaves Koba had arranged over the previous weeks matched almost perfectly the circular outline of the buried hatch that had remained invisible beneath the surface. Koba had never been asking people to look at random ground. He had been carefully tracing the forgotten boundary all along, preserving its location the only way he knew how. Mason lowered his eyes toward the weathered journals in his hands, then back to the calm gorilla standing quietly beyond the fence. And in that silent exchange, he felt the full weight of a painful realization settle over him. They had spent weeks trying to change Koba's behavior, when all along Koba had been trying to protect something they had forgotten themselves. For several long moments, nobody spoke. The preserve staff who had spent days debating Koba's behavior found themselves staring not only at the rediscovered chamber, but at the quiet gorilla who had never demanded attention for himself. Mason slowly replayed every morning in his mind. He remembered the broad leaf placed with such care, the circle of bark and stones, the patient tapping on the glass, and the countless times Koba had walked away without frustration when no one understood him. None of those actions had been random. Every movement had carried purpose, and every silent gesture had been an attempt to preserve something the humans themselves had forgotten. The realization settled over the group in different ways. The maintenance supervisor quietly folded the old engineering map and slipped it beneath his arm with unusual care, treating it less like paperwork and more like a family photograph that had almost been lost forever. The preserve director looked toward the enclosure, then lowered her eyes, remembering the order she had nearly signed that would have redirected Koba away from the eastern fence permanently. She did not speak for several seconds because there was nothing she could say that would erase how close they had come to dismissing the one individual who had understood the importance of that place. Mason remained standing beside the open hatch, unable to shake the feeling that Koba had been carrying the burden alone for far longer than anyone realized. What affected him most was not that the gorilla had helped uncover forgotten history. It was the patience behind it. Day after day, without anger or panic, Koba had repeated the same quiet message, trusting that eventually someone might stop long enough to listen. Mason slowly walked toward the observation fence until only a few feet separated them. Koba did not rush forward. He simply watched him with calm, attentive eyes. For the first time in weeks, there was no pointing, no arranging leaves, no silent request. The ritual had ended on its own. Mason removed his work gloves and rested one hand gently against the glass. Koba stepped closer, lifted his own hand, and placed it opposite Mason's on the other side of the barrier. Neither moved. The staff members watching from behind instinctively lowered their voices, as though they had entered a place where silence deserved respect. Several employees who had argued most strongly that Koba's behavior should be interrupted quietly volunteered to help preserve the rediscovered chamber instead of covering it again. The director immediately suspended all construction plans near the eastern section until every historical record could be carefully examined and protected. Mason proposed creating a permanent conservation display explaining the forgotten history of the site, not to celebrate the discovery itself, but to remind future staff that careful observation could matter just as much as advanced equipment. Before leaving the area, he opened his notebook to the very first page where he had once written the words, "repetitive behavior without explanation." He drew a single line through the sentence, and beneath it carefully wrote, "We were measuring the behavior instead of understanding the message." Looking back toward the enclosure, he saw Koba quietly return to his favorite resting place beneath the trees, moving with a calm confidence that had been missing for weeks. And in that moment, everyone silently agreed that from that day forward, they would begin listening to him with the patience he had always shown them. The weeks that followed changed the preserve in ways no one had expected. Instead of sealing the underground chamber again, the staff worked with conservation specialists and historians to carefully preserve it without disturbing its original structure. A narrow observation area was built at a respectful distance, allowing visitors to learn about the forgotten chapter of the preserve's history without placing unnecessary attention on the place itself. Mason insisted that the display focus not only on the rediscovered records, but also on the value of patient observation. The exhibit never claimed that Koba had solved a mystery like a person would. Instead, it simply acknowledged the undeniable truth that his persistent behavior had guided people to look again at something they had long overlooked. The change inside the preserve was even more meaningful than the new exhibit. Morning staff meetings now began with a simple question that had never been asked before. Had any animal shown a repeated behavior that deserved closer observation? Keepers started documenting patterns with greater care instead of rushing to explain them away. Veterinarians, maintenance workers, and wildlife specialists began sharing notes more often, realizing that understanding an animal sometimes required many perspectives instead of one quick conclusion. Mason quietly smiled every time he saw those conversations happen because he knew Koba had inspired them without making a sound. Koba himself gradually returned to the relaxed routine everyone remembered. He no longer carried bark or stones across the enclosure each dawn. The careful circles disappeared because there was no longer anything left to protect in the only language he knew. Instead, he spent his mornings exploring climbing structures, watching songbirds gather in nearby trees, and occasionally sitting beneath the same old shade tree where he had once withdrawn into silent determination. The heaviness that had settled over him during those long weeks slowly gave way to a calm curiosity that visitors noticed almost immediately. Children once again found him watching them with quiet interest, tilting his head as they laughed beyond the glass. One afternoon, Mason introduced a new enrichment activity using large wooden puzzle boxes filled with natural scents collected from different parts of the preserve. While the other gorillas rushed toward the unfamiliar objects, Koba approached at an unhurried pace, paused for a moment, and then gently selected the simplest box before carrying it into the sunlight. There was something deeply reassuring in that ordinary choice. For the first time in many weeks, his decisions no longer carried the weight of an unfinished responsibility. They reflected nothing more than peaceful curiosity. As the seasons gradually shifted, a small bronze plaque was placed near the observation area, overlooking the restored site. It contained only a brief message about listening carefully to the natural world and respecting the behaviors that scientists and caretakers might not immediately understand. Mason visited it occasionally before beginning his morning rounds, not out of obligation, but as a quiet reminder of how easily certainty could silence understanding. One crisp autumn sunrise, he looked toward the eastern side of the habitat almost by instinct. Koba was already awake, sitting comfortably beneath the trees as the first light filtered through the branches. For several peaceful minutes, the gorilla simply watched the morning arrive. Then he slowly glanced toward Mason, gave a calm nod of his head that seemed almost like quiet acknowledgement, and settled back against the tree without another glance toward the forgotten patch of earth. In that gentle moment, without rituals, signals, or silent appeals, Mason understood that Koba no longer felt the need to carry the message alone, because at last he knew he had truly been heard. Years passed, and the story quietly became part of the preserve's identity, not because of an extraordinary discovery hidden beneath the ground, but because it transformed the way people chose to see the living world around them. New rangers who joined the staff were always introduced to the Eastern Trail before learning anything else. Mason never began by showing them the restored chamber or the preserved documents. Instead, he would simply ask them to spend a few minutes watching the animals without taking notes, without making assumptions, and without trying to explain every movement too quickly. Only afterward would he tell them about the weeks when one patient gorilla had repeated the same silent message every morning while everyone searched for reasons to ignore it. The lesson was never presented as proof that animals understood human history or intended to solve human problems. Rather, it became a reminder that every living creature experiences its own world in ways people may never fully understand. Sometimes careful observation reveals patterns that deserve curiosity instead of instant judgment. That simple idea slowly influenced everything the preserve did. Research projects became more collaborative. Young interns learned to ask better questions before reaching confident conclusions. Visitors noticed small signs throughout the walking paths, encouraging them to slow down and truly watch instead of rushing from one exhibit to another. Many families later wrote letters describing how a single afternoon at the preserve had changed the way they looked at the wildlife in their own neighborhoods. Mason kept every one of those letters in a wooden drawer inside his office, not because they praised the preserve, but because they reminded him that understanding often begins with humility rather than expertise. Koba grew older with quiet dignity. His silver hairs gradually became more noticeable each passing season, and his days settled into an easy rhythm of climbing, resting beneath familiar trees, solving enrichment puzzles, and occasionally sitting where the morning sunlight reached the edge of the habitat. He never resumed the careful rituals that had once consumed his mornings. There was no longer any need. The burden he had carried had finally been shared. Visitors often paused when they saw him sitting peacefully, unaware that the calm before them had once been mistaken for confusion. Mason sometimes stood at a distance during those quiet mornings, watching Koba greet another sunrise without urgency, and he found comfort in the ordinary nature of the moment. Nothing dramatic happened anymore, and somehow that became the happiest ending of all. One autumn evening, just before the preserve closed, a young volunteer asked Mason what had been the most important discovery of his career. He looked toward Koba, who was calmly watching leaves drift through the afternoon breeze, and after a thoughtful silence he smiled before answering that the greatest discoveries were not always buried underground. Sometimes they waited patiently inside a truth that no one had taken the time to hear. As the last visitors walked toward the exit, the preserve grew quiet once again, and the first stars appeared above the trees. Koba remained peacefully beneath the fading light, while Mason closed the gate with a grateful heart, knowing that the greatest act of respect they could offer was not speaking for the animal, but learning to listen before deciding he had nothing left to say. The world becomes kinder the moment we choose understanding before certainty.